You're here with Hashtag VOA. I'm Michael Lippin in Washington, and I'm joined by Andrew Palczewski. Andrew, what's going on with social media?
Well, for weeks, Star Wars The Force Awakens has been trending, but there's also some real-life space exploration that's been trending thanks to Scott Kelly aboard the International Space Station.
That's right, and we're going to talk to two panelists here in the studio and in Moscow about how a pair of U.S. and Russian astronauts are coping with being in space for almost a year. And we're going to get to that right after Andrew does.
Do the thing. Roll it, Steve.
Welcome to Hashtag VOA. I'm Michael Lippin. It's day 305 for U.S. astronaut Scott Kelly, who's flying high above the Earth in the International Space Station. The main goal of his mission, to help NASA better understand how the human body reacts to long periods of time in orbit. We'll discuss that more in a few minutes, but first, Commander Kelly and Russian cosmonaut Mikhail Kornienko spoke to VOA's Ann Ball last week from the International Space Station. Here's some of what they had to say about the year in space.
What are some of the highlights of your research? What have you found so far?
So there are about 400 different scientific experiments going on here throughout the course of the year that Misha and I are here. And they're in all different scientific disciplines. Some of them, however, are dedicated to our time on board, and those are mostly related to our physiology. There are issues with long-duration spaceflight, and the longer you stay here, the problem or the problems that can occur with our physiology increase, such as bone loss and muscle loss, effects on our vision, even our cardiovascular health, effects on from the radiation environment, things like that. And we've done a lot of recording of the data. Last week we had an experiment in the Russian segment that used a lot of the imaging technology we have here on the U.S. segment, but using their device that puts negative pressure on our body to look at our, the vessels in our head and our heart and our eyes to see if there's an effect on our vision. And all this data that we've been collecting over there, it needs to go down to Earth and analyzed. And it's really not until the scientists have collected it all will they sit down and take a very close look and see exactly what we've learned and then report on it.
And how is your vision? Have you had any problems with your vision?
I was up here last time for 159 days, and I did have some effects on the physiology of my eyes that were measured actually when I returned. But my experience hasn't been much different than last time. I do notice some effects initially, but those have stabilized. But to add to your last question, what have we learned since we've been up here? One thing I have learned is that a year is a really long time.
We're almost at the end of that year. Well, that was Scott Kelly speaking with VOA's Ann Ball. Commander Kelly is a favorite with the social media crowd. He's got 835,000 fans just on Twitter. Let's go to Andrew Palczewski for more on what makes Scott Kelly such a hit on social media.
He is a huge hit, Michael. It's been about a year since Scott Kelly last set foot on Earth. Thanks to social media, though, he's managed a very human connection to his home planet. It all began with this declaration from President Obama during his 2015 State of the Union address. Take a look.
And in 2 months, to prepare us for those missions, Scott Kelly will begin a year-long stay in space. So good luck, Captain. Make sure to Instagram it.
Well, Kelly took the president's suggestion to Instagram his voyage to heart, using social media and the hashtag #YearInSpace to connect us to his journey. And in doing so, he reminds us that even though he's floating in space, he's still human like the rest of us. Case in point, this shot of Kelly doing something millions of Americans do every week, watching a U.S. football game, in this case a playoff game featuring his hometown of Houston, Texas. He's also been a part of some major events here on Earth, like the blizzard that swamped the east coast of the United States this past week. While Kelly doesn't have to shovel his driveway like the rest of us, he is, like millions of others, tweeting about the storm and giving us a new perspective with his photo from above. 1 year and 336 photos later, Kelly responds to the president's initial call asking, "How am I doing, Mr. President?" Well, it looks like he's done an outstanding job of not only bringing us along for the ride, but showing us that at the heart of this space mission is a living, breathing human being. Not so different from you or me. Michael?
Thanks so much, Andrew. Well, it's time to introduce our guests for the show. We have two space watchers. First, in our DC studio, we have Dr. David Grinspoon. He is a senior scientist with the Planetary Science Institute in Arizona and also a columnist for Sky and Telescope magazine. And by Skype from Moscow, Russia, we have Matthew Bodner. He is the defense and space correspondent for the Moscow Times. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Well, I'd like to start with David here in the studio. You know, we heard from Scott Kelly about all the physical challenges that astronauts face on the space station. And from what I've read, there are so many ways in which being in space for a long time could harm the body. How much awareness is there on social media here in the U.S. and generally about the challenges that these astronauts are facing?
I don't think people really have a sense of what it is like to go and spend long periods of time in space. I think, you know, we get a lot of our imagery, say, from Hollywood movies that kind of gloss over a lot of that.
You just see astronauts floating around. It looks like a lot of fun, right?
Yeah, and even when they focus on, you think of a movie like Gravity that does focus on some of the dangers and the things that can go wrong. Which is, you know, one of the challenges, obviously. But there's also just the day-to-day or month-to-month, or in this case, almost year-to-year challenge of adaptation to that environment, which is not our natural environment. I mean, we evolved for 4 billion years on the surface of a planet. And there are a lot of ways in which we are very, very well evolved for this surface environment, and ways in which we're not aware of until we extract ourselves from it. And some of that we can take with us, the pressure of the air, the oxygen and so forth, but gravity is something that's very hard to do artificially. In fact, there are ways on a large space station you could spin it and sort of do artificial gravity, but on something the size of the International Space Station, there's no way to do artificial gravity. And so it's really interesting to see what they're learning about all these aspects of our own selves, our own physiology that we take for granted that don't work in the right way once we take ourselves out of that gravitational field.
Well, to Matt Bodner in Moscow, what are you hearing from people in Russia about these physical challenges that Scott Kelly and Mikhail Kornienko are enduring?
Well, I'd say in general, the year-long mission has not been as publicized in Russia as it has been in the United States. But there's definitely support for this mission and support for these types of endeavors in Russia. The International Space Station is as much of their project as it is our project, and it does make a lot of headlines and gets a lot of play in social media. So, yeah.
Well, how much popular support do these astronauts have in Russia?
The cosmonauts are noticeably less active on Twitter than the NASA astronauts, and so I'd say moderate social media support. What gets people going more in Russia is announcements of new projects, new rockets, very visual things, and less focus on the science. And one of the unfortunate reasons behind that is that Roscosmos is not doing as much science as NASA, but it is, of course, part of the year-long mission. But it's just not as much part of their PR play. The science is not as much part of it. Like I said, the visuals, the rockets launching, the big space station, and things like that.
Well, what else interests you, David Grinspoon, here in the studio about this year in space mission?
Well, I think they have done a great job. Certainly, I can only speak to this country and my experience and what I see, how I see people reacting online and so forth. But the connection between the astronauts and people on the ground has been deeper and more lively than I've ever seen before.
And part of that's through social media, right?
I think it's a really good example of the positive side of social media. You know, we can talk about some of the negative sides, I'm sure you guys have at times, but it's really wonderful I mean, I'm one of those, what was it, 865,000 followers of Scott Kelly, and I have such admiration for him because not only is he, you know, doing this brave and really interesting and scientifically interesting thing, but I think of him as a real artist in the pictures that he is sending down. He's got a photographic eye, you know, what he chooses to show us and what he says about them. It's this ongoing, you know, realization that we're all having of this amazing planet that we inhabit, and we're seeing it in this new way through these guys. And so I find that really important and profound.
Right, and we're going to take a look at some of the imagery that is coming from Scott Kelly's Twitter feed. But it's time for a short break. When we come back, Scott Kelly will share more about his time in space, and stay tuned.
This is the voice.
Sharing America's voice with the world. For more than 70 years. VOA, sharing a voice that says we report the truth.
I'm Bill Arcega. I'm the host of VOA's The Correspondents, a roundup of the world's top stories with analysis from our dedicated reporters. It's really a conversation the same way that you would bring a friend to your home and ask them what's going on. And our correspondents will do that and answer those questions through their own eyes.
That appears a false choice in more ways than one.
We can't actually put you there, but we can come pretty close. In 30 minutes, we'll show you the world.
Welcome back to Hashtag VOA. I'm Michael Lippin. Well, given the chilly relationship between Washington and Moscow right now, how is diplomacy faring inside the International Space Station? VOA's Ann Ball asked Russia's Mikhail Kornienko about that during her interview last week. Let's have a listen.
Yes, and I wanted to ask Mikhail this question, that in an interview before you left Earth, you said, if we could send the two presidents up for 2 weeks, problems on Earth would be settled. So what do you think about that now, 10 months later? Is it time to use the space station for such high-level talks? Is this the way to get peace in the world?
Ну, сейчас я могу только подтвердить мои слова до старта.
I can only confirm the words that I said prior to launch.
Потому что я все больше убеждаюсь.
Because I become more and more confirmed in the fact that, given how long we've been here on station and during the entire flight, which is a proof, that how we can effectively work together, we, meaning people from different countries, of different confessions, together in space for the benefit of humanity. So I can only confirm my words. If we could send our politicians here for a month or a month and a half, then all the problems on Earth would be resolved much easily.
Well, let's see if that prediction does come true. That was Russian cosmonaut Mikhail Kornienko speaking with VOA's Ann Ball. Well, let's check in now with Andrew, who's following the story on social media. Andrew.
Absolutely. Well, in addition to hashtag Year in Space, astronaut Scott Kelly has been using another hashtag in many of his social media posts, hashtag EarthArt, to show that even during a very scientific space mission, it's impossible to ignore the Earth's artistic beauty. Kelly enforces that idea, telling us that Earth without art is just the letters EH. In other words, minus the letters ART, a clever play on words, but also a statement about the beauty of our planet. He pairs those words with this image, the deserts of Sudan lit up by the setting sun. In another post, he tells us that Earth can be very sophisticated about what she displays on her canvas. Interestingly, he doesn't identify the location of this photo. In fact, he doesn't for many of the images he posts, seeming to suggest that where the photo is secondary to what it represents. But sometimes the location does matter, and the artistic images carry a message. Take, for example, this image high above Asia. It depicts beautiful contrasting colors, but as Kelly informs us, they're caused by heavy pollution on the left being blocked by the mountains on the right. Again, it's a new perspective, not just from a different vantage point, but from a different way of looking at the world and the issues we face each day. Now, David, we heard in that segment art and science combined. We heard in the clip from cosmonaut Kornienko diplomacy and science combined. These aren't necessarily things we would think would go hand in hand, but social media is helping to join those. Do you think social media is going to be an effective tool for that, and an effective tool for bringing more people into the space program and getting them interested in it?
I think it is. You know, one of the challenges of the human space program is the fact that the people that have actually been up in orbit have this very profound sense that it changes them, and the view of Earth is so important. And even we heard this sentiment about if the world's leaders could could go into space, they would that conflict would be resolved. People sometimes call it the overview effect. But part of the problem is there's a very small number of people that have experienced that. But in a certain way now with social media and with the kind of artful broadcasting that people like Scott Kelly, really especially Scott Kelly, is doing, that everyone's participating in that. And I think that's really positive and sort of helps solve that problem of, you know, there's going to be a long time before a lot of us get to go into space. But there's a very real way in which we're all getting to experience an important part of that.
See these photos. I mean, one of the comments that I was struck by on Instagram, somebody said, when is the coffee table book coming out? And that's not something you hear a lot about scientific endeavors. So it really is helping to connect that and show a new light. Yeah,
I mean, you know, this planet is so beautiful. And a lot of us went into planetary science, which is my field, because we're inspired by that and we want to understand it. And, you know, people think of science as sort of cold and clinical, and maybe aspects of it are. But I love this Earth art project because to me it kind of connects all that back to the original sense of wonder and just appreciation of the beauty that motivates a lot of the science in the first place.
Well, there's also a lot of art to cooperating between these two great powers, the U.S. and Russia. And I want to ask Matt Bodner, how did the U.S. and Russia start cooperating in space in the first place? Because I understand you've written quite a lot about that.
Yeah, so U.S.-Russia space relations, they go back to 1975, which was the first time there was a cooperative mission. A remaining Apollo spacecraft from the moon program was set aside to rendezvous with the Soviet Soyuz. And it was all orchestrated as part of Nixon's policy of détente at the time, a way to engage each other in a sphere where there was pretty intense and very visual competition. That unfortunately fell away to like renewed tensions between the superpowers in the 80s. But each side continued to move forward in space. The U.S. had the space shuttle, a vehicle designed with the space station in mind, but funding never materialized for the United States to build a space station before the end of the Cold War. Russia, on the other hand, built 6 or 7 space stations before the International Space Station. So we had this really, really rich history of building and designing space stations. And together, these two things meshed very nicely. And so in the 90s, when you have the two sides come together and start to sort of set the table of reconciliation between the former superpowers, space was an obvious way to engage each other. And so core competencies from each side were mixed, and together they made the International Space Station, which is the largest space project. And today you can consider it to be the largest international peacetime project ever attempted. And it's been quite a success diplomatically.
Matt, how does that U.S.-Russian space cooperation work in practice on the ground? We see how Scott and Mikhail are getting along pretty nicely up there in space, but what's going on behind the scenes?
They have a very interesting and deep relationship. A lot of that has to do with personnel exchange. For example, NASA has people deployed, around like 30 or 40 people here in Moscow at any given time at several locations owned by the Russian Space Agency. And the Russian Space Agency has people in Houston as well. And so they interface on the working level on a daily basis, recurring contact with a very clear goal. And the message here is that what strengthens bilateral relations, and it really only happened in space, is daily, meaningful contacts. And they're really the only set of government officials that you can see that don't publicly sometimes have spats. And I'm sure in other areas they don't do it as well, like nuclear security. But there's a great effort from both sides to keep things cordial and professional and just keep the eyes on the mission. And that's been going on for 15 years through several political crises. And it weathered the most recent one, which has definitely been the most dramatic since the end of the Cold War. So they've definitely got a very deep and meaningful relationship.
Right, so they're getting along very well. And I wanted to ask David Grinspoon, how do you see U.S. and Russian space cooperation going into the future?
Well, from the scientists' side of it, not the diplomats necessarily or even the engineers, but the scientists themselves, which is my role, it always has just made so much sense to find a way to work together, because science is inherently international. Even during the Cold War, when the U.S. and the Soviets had our separate programs to try to send missions to Mars and missions to Venus, the scientists were, trying to find ways to cooperate and send each other data, because we wanted their Venus probes to work. They wanted our Venus probes to work, because it's all Earth trying to find out about Venus.
So there's on their own, right?
Right. There's a certain way in which the knowledge itself and the questions we're driven to answer don't respect any kind of borders and any kind of national identity. So I think the science will always be a force acting to try to overcome whatever boundaries get imposed by these other very real human, foibles.
Right. Well, on that note, we're going to squeeze in one more short break. Please stay with us.
We're able to touch on things that are important to people on an everyday basis. We hope that our viewers are getting inspired when they watch our show. They're getting a view of the world from a different perspective, things that perhaps are not in their immediate vicinity. Today, I could put in on the show something that is a little different, a little unique, and this gives me that, inspiration to come to work.
Welcome back to Hashtag VOA. While Scott Kelly was watching the blizzard that struck the U.S. East Coast from space, some Washington, D.C. residents took a time out from the storm to engage, as you see here, in a snowball fight. Most of the Capitol is shut down this Tuesday, but we're here to keep you informed. And on the note of that snowball fight, I understand, Michael, you have something to do with that.
Well, not only did I have something to do with it, I was actually the organizer. You know, I've been actually organizing snowball fights in Washington for the last 6 years with two buddies of mine, Ami Greener and Dennis Baranov, and we've been using a Facebook page called the Washington, D.C. Snowball Fight Association. It's an association that does not exist, except in our minds. But it's an idea that's resonated. It's been really popular. Over this past weekend during the blizzard, we had more than 500 people show up to DuPont Circle Park. It was great fun. And it's the only Facebook page of its kind in the world that's actively organizing snowball fights. And I think this could only happen in Washington because it actually doesn't snow much here. If we tried to do this, try to replicate this model somewhere else in the world where it snowed all the time, people would get so sick of it, they'd be like, come on, guys, stop organizing these. But I think it's definitely a DC thing. And I've actually learned a lot from this whole experience about how the power of social media to mobilize people. And I wanted to talk a little bit about this to David. So I've learned that social media really can bring people together to have fun. And it can also be a powerful tool in terms of future space exploration for the human race. What do you have to share about that notion?
Well, it really is, at its best, this inherently very inclusive tool that, it's an equalizer. People from all around the world are exchanging information and ideas, certainly about science, and different kinds of scientists have different kinds of presence on social media, but certainly some who are even a big deal in science are still make themselves accessible, and you can actually have a conversation and learn what they're thinking, and also sort of with the cocktail party nature of Twitter and stuff, you can kind of listen in on the conversations of others, and there is this sort of inclusiveness, which is really nice. I thought it was interesting what you said about that this could only happen in Washington because it's it's an unusual event when there's a snowfall, and there is this sense of the world transformed and this sort of gleeful sense that I think you tap into. But I was thinking with respect to our earlier segment, so if we could get the world leaders to go up in the space station, and then if we could have them solve their conflicts with snowball fights, then I think we'd be really be onto something.
Huge social media.
Yeah,
exactly.
For sure.
On the subject of snowballs, we had Scott Kelly actually do a little sporting endeavor on the space station. We might have video of that to show you. He was actually using what looks like table tennis paddles to hit little globules of water back and forth. So perhaps he could even do that with snowballs at some point, I wonder. But Matt Bodner in Moscow, what are your thoughts about the power of social media to bring people together, even Russians, to support getting humans further out into space than ever before?
Well, it's obviously a natural tool to do that. The biggest problem to promoting spaceflight is that people don't know how to visualize it and contextualize it in their lives. And you have seen some greater effort from the cosmonauts in Roscosmos to publicize photos the cosmonauts are taking, but it's just a matter of sharing information, and like we talked about the overview effect earlier, spreading that message and that feeling to as many people as possible. And right now, I think social media is the best way to do that, with the astronauts writing firsthand what they're seeing and what they're feeling.
Andrew, you want to weigh in here? Yeah, David, to that point, we talked about how they're sharing the photos and things. They're using hashtag Year in Space, hashtag Earth Art. Where does the social media go from here? As you said, there are only a finite number of astronauts who can share this experience, but maybe people on the ground can take this and kind of run with it?
Absolutely. I mean, you see that happening with, not just social media, but related, citizen science is a really growing thing where people are getting directly involved in research. And of course, social media is a great tool for that, but it extends beyond that. And as Scott Kelly said earlier, they're just gathering the information, and it's up to people on the ground, the scientists, to figure out what it all means. And so out of this experience, there'll be a lot of work, a lot of science to do for years and years to come, and projects. And I could imagine that citizen science will be a part of that. I think agencies like NASA are learning more and more that the more people you engage and include in research in a way that's not just superficial, the more that awareness spreads. And I think that
and humanizes it too, because like you said, it's seen as cold and clinical, but these are actual people doing actual experiments. Scott Kelly's up there bouncing water between ping pong paddles.
Yeah, I mean, science can be really fun too, and I think this demystifies it when people get to be a part of it and get to sort of even just kind of lurk on the conversations and sort of see how it's working. So I think that spreading awareness of what the science is all about and ability to participate in it is another side that's also important, in addition to what we were talking about with just the actual spreading of those images from space to a wider and wider group of people.
Well, just to bring Matt Bodner back from Moscow, where is the conversation in Russia now about what Russia does next in space? I understand they want to get to the moon, whereas the U.S. is focused pretty much on Mars.
Yeah. So the conversation about the future of space in Russia is interesting right now because all of the grand plans that they could come up with are really very heavily limited by the economy. The ruble has collapsed in the last year, and right now Russia is in the process of drafting its new 10-year space policy, which lays out priority areas for funding over the next 10 years. That has been rewritten several times now before it's not even been approved, and it's now less than half of what the initial goal was. That said, they want to go to the moon. They want to do the developmental work on their rockets to do that, but all of that work has been kicked from 2030 now to 2035. So I think the conversation now is going to focus on how to maintain Russia's current abilities in space and not have any decay as they attempt to get their house in order and move forward. And unfortunately, that's a very different mission than NASA has envisioned for itself over the next decade. So it's hard to see where Russia and NASA go after ISS, but I think they'll find a way to work together on these missions.
Yeah, and just to bring David back in one more time, briefly, the pros and cons of going to the moon rather than Mars, what do you have to think about that?
Yeah, well, so this has been a debate, moon first versus Mars first. And, honestly, there's good arguments for both. The moon is so much closer, and you can build up an operational capacity and learn how to do things on, this very non-Earth-like environment. So there's an argument that you do that before you make the long, difficult, dangerous journey to Mars. But there's also a sense, I think, amongst American space enthusiasts and participants that it's been so long since Apollo. We've been going around and around the Earth, and now obviously somebody like Scott Kelly is putting that in the best possible light, and it's pretty inspiring. But nonetheless, people want to go somewhere new, and I think Mars is the obvious next place that we're going to go with people.
Yeah, and actually, we're going to end our show right now because we're out of time. But thanks to our guests, Dr. David Grinspoon, here in our DC studio, and also Matt Bodner in Moscow. On behalf of Andrew and the whole team here at Hashtag VOA, thanks so much for watching. You can visit us on the web at voanews.com/hashtag VOA. You can also tweet us at Hashtag VOA. We'll see you next week.